Hilchos Klei Hamikdash v'ha'ivdim bai perek shvi, the laws of the utensils of the Holy Temple and those who work there, chapter 7. Today is an easy chapter, very interesting chapter. It basically covers all the major jobs that there were in the temple. Everybody always wants to know, what were the jobs? You know, if you were a Kohen working in the Holy Temple, if you were on site, what were some of the things that had to be taken care of? And the Rambam tells us today, Halacha Aleph, Chamisha Asar Memunin Hayu B'Hamikdash. There were always 15 officers, 15 appointees in the Holy Temple. V'chein memanim la'olam al kol davar mechamisha asar dvarim elu memuna echad. And similarly, forevermore, we always make sure there's one person appointed over each of these 15 positions, which the Rambam will now list in short and then expound upon for the entirety of the chapter. Ve'elu hein, they are the following. Number one, Aleph al hazmanim. There was one officer appointed over the times. And again, we're going to define each of these things. Beis al ne'ilas sha'arim. Number two was the officer appointed over the locking of the gates. Gimel al hashemrim. Number three is the officer appointed over the guards. Dalid al hamishayrim. Number four was the officer appointed over the singers. Hey al hatziltzal im shar klei shir. Number five was the officer appointed over the cymbals and the other instruments. Vav al hapyasais. Number six was the officer appointed over the raffles. Zayin al hakinim. Number seven was the officer appointed over the pairs of birds. Ches al hachoisamais. Number eight was the officer appointed over the receipts. Tes al hanesachim. Number nine was the officer appointed over the libation. That means the wine, the flour, the oil that used to accompany every sacrifice. Yud al hachoilim. Number 10 was the officer appointed over the sick, the local doctor. Yud aleph al hamayim. Number 11 was the officer appointed over the water. Yud beis al maseh lechem hapanim. Number 12 was the officer appointed over making the showbread, the lechem hapanim that was there from week to week. Yud gimel al maseh akteres. Number 13 was the officer for making the incense. Yud daled al maseh hapareiches. Number 14 was the officer in charge of making the curtains in the temple. And tesvav al maseh bigdei kahuna. Number 15 was the person in charge of making the priestly garments. Halacha beis. Kol echad ve'echad mimemunim elu. Every one of the appointees, the officers in these positions, tachas yodei anashim harbe. He wasn't a one-man do it alone. Under him there was many men. Kedei lahachin amlacha shu memuna aleha, to prepare whatever work it was that he was appointed over. And now let's go through one by one. Zeh sha'al azmanim. Number one, the person in charge of the times. Huva anashav mishamrim es azmanim. Him and his men, they kept the schedule. They kept the schedule of times in the temple. Kevan shiagia eis hakarban. Whenever the time for bringing a sacrifice would arrive, machris hu oy echad me'anashav birshusay, either him or one of his men with his permission would announce the oimer and say, imdu kayanim la'avayda uleviim laduchan v'yisrael la'maimad. Rise up, stand up, the kohanim for their service, the leviim for the platform to sing, and the Jews, the regular Yisraelim, for the maimad service, as we learned yesterday. They were the ones that were working simultaneously to represent the Jewish people by standing by the communal offerings. When the person in charge of the times, when his voice was heard, everybody came running to their jobs. Halacha Gimel, officer number 2. Zeh sha'al ne'ilas sha'arim. The person who was in charge of the locking of the gates, al piv ne'alin v'al piv peisch. And it was on his word that they would lock the gates in the evening, and it was on his word that they would open the gates in the morning. Ve'eina toikin b'chol yom, lipsichas hasha'arim ela birshusay. The kohanim who used to blow trumpets at the opening of the gates each morning would only blow at his command, at his behest. In other words, the Rambam's telling us that that's what used to happen. They would open the gates in the morning and they would blow a trumpet to mark the beginning of the day. Every day there were 3 sounds that were blown in the Holy Temple for the opening of the gates. Tkiya, truo, tkiya, a long blast, a short blast, and then a long blast. Halacha dalid, number 3, zeshal hashemrim. The officer that was in charge of the guards, we actually already learned about him, who ish harabayis, he was the man of the temple mound, shemisabev al halevim b'chol layla, who would make his rounds by the groups of the Levites who were guarding all around all night. B'chol mishayashin al mishmarai, any Levi that was found sleeping on duty, malka oisei b'maklai, he can beat him with his stick, v'seiref es ksusei, and burn his clothing, as we learned in the end of the last set of laws. Halacha hey, officer number 4, zeh sha'al hamishayrim. The officer in charge of the singers, who beirer b'chol yom, he would choose every day hamishayrim sha'oimdim al haduchan leimar shira b'peh, who would be the singers to stand on the platform to say the song vocally. As we saw the other day, the service of Hashem in song is the vocal singing. There happened to also be instruments, but the main avodah was the shira bepeh, was the vocal song. So he would choose who would be the vocalists. Additionally, by his instruction, the Kohanim would blow the trumpets for the sacrifices. Besides for blowing trumpets when the gates were opened, there was also a special trumpet blowing that would take place to accompany the sacrifices. This guy would be the one to choose them and give the instruction. In Peichasin Hamikdash, once we're talking about trumpet blows, the Rambam says we don't have any less in the temple. There's no less than 21 blasts that are blown every day. 3 blasts at the opening of the gates. 9 blasts accompanying the morning daily sacrifice, and 9 blasts accompanying the daily evening sacrifice. 9 meaning tkiya through a tkiya 3 times. Long blast, short blast, long blast 3 times. Any day that the Jewish people brought an additional sacrifice, like Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, holidays, Moisifin Teishal Karban Musaf, there would be another 9 blasts to accompany the additional sacrifice. If the new month or a holiday came out to coincide with Shabbos, or the new year came out to be on Shabbos, Sheyesham, Shleisham, Musafin, in which case you actually had 3 additional sacrifices, Shabbos, Rosh Hashanah, and Rosh Chodesh. You don't blow again and again for each additional sacrifice. And it's just 9 extra blasts for the Musaf, for the additional sacrifices. Halacha Vav, be'erev Shabbos Meisifin Sheish. Every Friday, there was another 6 blasts that were added to the daily routine of trumpet blasts. Shalish lahavdil esa'am min amlacha. 3 to stop people from working close to Shabbos. V'shalish lahavdil ben kodesh l'chayil. And 3 just before the onset of Shabbos to differentiate between weekday and Shabbos, holy and mundane. Ubaregel, on a holiday, Meisifin Shalish Lipskier shara tachten. It would add an additional 3 during the day for the opening of the lower gate, v'hu shar ezras nashim, which is the gateway to the women's court. I'm going to show this map, even though it's going to come up later. But basically, this is the gateway to the women's court, right over here. V'shalish Lipskier shara elya and hu shar nikaner. And they also added 3 blasts when they opened up the upper gate, the nikaner's gate, that we talked about in the laws of the Holy Temple, the last set of laws. And why is it called the upper gate? Because it's higher, it's above the women's court. You have to walk up steps to get there. You also would add an additional 3 blasts for the filling of the water that was poured on the Mizbeach on Sukkos. Simchas Beis HaShe'eva, every day of Sukkos there was a special water libation. And for the water libation, when they would fill up the water, they would blow 3 blasts. On the Shabbos of Sukkos, they wouldn't blow for the filling of the water. There was also 3 that were blown on the Mizbeach when they would pour the water actually. So 3 when they would fill up the water, 3 when they poured the water. And so the Rambam underlines his point, any Kohen, any time that was blowing a trumpet in accompaniment to a sacrifice of whatever sort it may be, it was always done under the authority and by the instruction of the officer in charge of the singers. I already baked it into the cake, but the Rambam now makes the point that these blasts were not made with a shofar, they were with trumpets, because in the temple most of the blows were done with trumpets. Halacha Zayin, moving on to the next officer, Zesha al Hatziltzal, the person in charge of the cymbals and other instruments, Hu Hamamid Kol HaMeshayrerim Al Pi Klei Shir Shasaya Dinim HaLeviyim. He was the one who would arrange the musicians with their instruments that would help the Levites who were singing vocally, as we explained the other day. Halacha Ches, officer number 6, Zesha al Pioses, the officer in charge of the raffles, Hu Meifis Ben HaKoyanim B'chol Yoim, he would make the raffle every day between the Kohanim for the services, Ad Sheyiyeh Kol Ish V'ish Oiseh Malachtoi Shezacha Ba B'Payis, till each man would do the work that he was assigned to, that he would win in the raffle. The Arba Pa'anim Hayu Mefisin B'chol Yoim, they would do 4 raffles a day. Hilchos Tmidin Avoyer Ketzad Hayu Mefisin. In the laws of the daily sacrifice, the Rambam goes through the ritual daily service in the temple, and he will explain how the raffle was done. You can basically see it here in the picture. Everybody would stand around. One person's hat was removed. He would be the starting point. Every person would stick out either 1 or 2 fingers. The guy would call out a random number, count the fingers, and based on wherever the number landed, that was the person who won that particular raffle. Halacha Tes, officer now, number 7. The officer appointed over the pairs of birds, Hu Shepoiskin Imai, he is the one with whom it would be arranged sheyimker hakinim lakarbanos kach v'kach b'sela, that he would sell pairs of birds for sacrifices at the rate of so much and so much for a silver coin. Many, many people who had a ritual type of impurity, the way that they would conclude their purification process was by bringing a pair of birds as a sacrifice. And so there constantly had to be available pairs of birds in the temple. This person was the one in charge of setting the rate for how much we're going to charge for a pair of birds. And then anybody who would have to bring 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, that's the 2 types of birds that were kosher for sacrifices, Yavi Dmeim Lamikdash, he would bring the money's worth to the holy temple. And whoever was in charge of the pairs of birds would actually give the pair of birds to the person who needed to bring the sacrifice. Then he would make a calculation with the treasurers of the holy temple treasury, and they would give the money, and that way temple treasury was funded. Says the Rambam, every 30 days they would reevaluate and refix the rate of the pairs of birds, just in case there was a market fluctuation, If in the interim, let's say the beginning of a month, they set the price, and then during that month, the price of birds goes down, maspik kashar azoil, he needs to keep providing the temple treasury with a lower rate. Hekdesh, temple treasury, always has the upper hand. So even though at the beginning of the month they fixed the rate, if the worth is now lower, they only have to pay the lower rate. Hukru, on the other hand, if they became more expensive, maspik kamesha paskui, he must still supply at a loss at the rate that they fixed at the beginning of the month. Sheyad hekdesh al yaina. The hand of a temple treasury is always on the upper. Similarly, if a pair of birds was discovered to be disqualified, or it became disqualified before it was sacrificed, he needs to supply another one. You don't have to pay again. He needs to give it and suffer the loss. That's part of his job as being in charge of the pairs of birds. Halacha Yud, we turn now to officers 8 and 9. They're going to kind of work together as we're about to see. The officer in charge of the receipts, he would take the money from those who were obligated to bring libations, accompaniments to their sacrifices, and he would give them receipts. Basically, buying libations in the temple was a 2-step process. You have to turn in the money and get a receipt, take your receipt to the stand, give in the receipt, and get your order. The 9th officer, the libations man, he was actually selling you the libations. How would it work? What was the process? There were 4 categories, 4 receipts in the temple, because there was a maximum of 4 variations of libations that you could bring. One of them said calf, because when you bring a cow as a sacrifice, a bull, there's 1 set of libations you have to bring along with it. Second one says male ram. Male ram was a lower level, different amount of libations that were brought with the ram. Number 3 set upon it kid goat. Kid goat is even smaller amount of libations. And the 4th one had the word sinner written on it, catering to a very specific type of case, a person who has tzaras, and he was wealthy and could afford it. He had to bring a 4th type of libation that didn't fit into any of the 3 classic types. So when a person would bring his animal sacrifice to the temple, so you brought the animal, but you didn't have the flour and the oil and the wine. So you would bring money for that. And you give the money to the person who was in charge of the receipts. Let's call him this guy on the left. He had the receipts. And then, he would give you tags corresponding to the number of your sacrifices. If you were a rich person afflicted with tzaras, he would give him that 1 receipt where it says the word sinner on it. Then you walked across the hall or across the room, and with the receipts in hand, you would go to the person in charge of the libations, and he would supply the libations according to the number of receipts as it's written on the receipts. And then each night, these 2 suppliers had to make an accounting. They came to each other. This one would produce the receipts that he had gotten, and he would get the money back from the original guy who got the money. If there's extra money, for whatever reason, it goes to the temple treasury. If there's less money, the person in charge of the receipts suffers the loss. Why is there a discrepancy here? You got to cover the difference. If somebody is on temple grounds and is claiming that his receipt was lost, Mamtinin loy ad ha'erev. We wait till the evening, because anyways in the evening is going to be an accounting. If there was extra money corresponding to the amount of the receipt which he's claiming is lost, we give it to him. That's accurate. If not, if it's not the exact amount of money, we don't give it to him. The name of every day was written on the receipt because of scammers. If there was no date, he would buy a receipt and pocket it till he knows that the libation is going up in price, make some money on his purchase. So to protect from such scammers, the date was placed, and that's it. It was only valid for that day. Halacha Yud Gimel says the Rambam, in the same way as the rates were fixed for the birds every month, so too here, Mishleishim Yom Lishleishim Yom, every 30 days, Poiskin Sharayayin V'Hasoiles Im HaMemun Al HaNesachim. It would fix the rate for the wine or for the flour with the person who was in charge of the libations. And in the interim, during that month, Im Hukru Nesachim Mesapik Len Kamesha Pasku Imai, even if the libations price goes up, he must supply as they originally fixed at the beginning of the month. V'im Huzlu Mesapik Len Keshar Azel, but if they went down in price, he needs to now provide at the cheaper rate. Whenever Hekdesh makes extra money for these prices, that's called the extras that come from the libations. What do they do with this extra money? They would buy offerings on standby. Whenever it was not a busy day in the temple and you need to bring some offerings to keep the Mizbeach busy, it's called dessert for the Mizbeach, they would bring these offerings. But you never bring this dessert, extra offerings, as birds. There is no communal offering that's a bird, so only animals. Halacha Yudalid, officer number 10. HaKoyanim, all the Kohanim working in the temple, because they were constantly standing on the floor, barefoot on the floor, cold floor, stone floor. They were eating lots of meat. They didn't have any clothing on them, only one tunic, as we're going to learn later in these laws. And they would always be sick in their stomachs. A lot of stomach aches going around. Therefore, we had to appoint one officer. He should visit them, heal all their sicknesses. He was constantly busy with them, him and his men. There was always somebody sick to take care of in the temple. Halacha Tezvav, officer number 11. We always would appoint a person, his job was to dig pits and ditches, as well as to fix public pits, public wells. So water should always be accessible in Jerusalem for all those who dwelled there, and for all those who would pilgrimage every holiday to the temple. Upon him, number 12, there was a man who was appointed over all the artisans who would make the showbread. It was a very complex art. There was one family who was very good at that. He was in charge of them. He would fix all the work associated with the showbread. The Echad, officer 13, they were in charge of all the artisans related to the incense, and he fixed its work. Halacha Tazayin, officer number 14, the person in charge of the curtains in the temple, he was in charge of all the weavers who would weave the curtains, and all the embroiderers who would embroider designs into the weave. He was in charge that all of the curtains should be ready for their purpose at the Heichal temple structure and for all the gates around it. The main curtain, the one that would divide between the holy and the Holy of Holies, which was actually a combination of two curtains, as we saw in chapter 4 of the last set of laws, they would make two of those, they would remake those two every year. Every strand that went into the weave of the curtain was sixfold. There was 4 types of material in it: linen, blue wool, purple wool, and red wool. Don't know if you saw, but literally 2 days ago there was going around a big archaeology find that they found what seems to be telas shani, this crimson red wool from thousands of years ago in Israel. Fascinating find. Check it out online. And each one was sixfold. So you had 6 strings of linen, 6 of blue wool, 6 of purple wool, 6 of red wool. And then, so if you have 6 times 4, there's really 24 strings per strand. If you have tzitzis, like you see this even today. Or tzitzis strings looks like one string, but then you start unraveling it, and there's multiple strings in the string. So every string was really a conglomerate of 24 strings. sixfold of 4 types. The tefach hayavia was so thick, it was a tefach, it was a handbreadth thick. It was woven over 72 heddles. Remember this kind of a simplistic picture from the laws of Shabbat, just to show you how weaving used to work. There were 2 frames with holes, and you would put the strings through the holes, and they were alternate. You would raise one frame, and then put what's called the woof. The cross thread would go across, then you'd switch the frames and bring the cross thread back. That's the way you wove, in between the alternates of the 2 frames. So here, typically, you have 5, 10 heddles. The parechas was woven on a basis of 72 heddles, very big. The main curtain was 40 amas long, 20 amas wide, which is basically 60 feet tall, 30 feet wide, very big. Halacha Yud Zayin, in addition to the main curtains, but dividing between the Holy and the Holy of Holies, there was a total of 13 curtains in the second temple. 7 for the 7 gates of the Azara. We're missing one highlight here, but there should be 3 on this side, 3 on that side, 1 on this side. That's 7 gates in the temple courtyard. The Achas al Pesach ulam, the Achas al Pesach heichal, 1 at the entrance to the ulam, to the antechamber, 1 at the entrance to the actual heichal. Ushtayim ladvir beinayu ben HaKodesh, and 2 to the dvir, that's the name for the Kodesh HaKadoshim, between it and the holy. Ushtayim kenegdan ba'aliyah, and there was 2 more on the upper story, because there was 2 stories of this Kodesh HaKadoshim, also dividing in the place where the Holy and Holy of Holies would meet. So that's a total of 13, right? Because you have 7, this is an extra one, this shouldn't be a circle here. It's 7 over here, 8, 9, 10, 11 on the first floor, 12 and 13 on the second floor. If a curtain became impure, with a baby level of impurity. We once spoke about this, I'm going to have it at length in the Rambam's 10th book, that impurity goes in levels. There's what's called avatuma, a father, a primary source of impurity. And then if something touches the primary source of impurity, it becomes a child of impurity. To the 1st degree, to the 2nd degree, to the 3rd degree, even 4th and 5th degrees sometimes. So if one of the curtains became impure by a lower level source of impurity, not a primary source, they would dip it in the mikvah that was inside the temple courtyard. There was a huge mikvah built by King Solomon, and the whole curtain could fit in there. They would dip it in there to purify it, and put it right back in place, because for becoming impure with a lower level impurity, you don't have to wait till sundown to become fully pure. But if one became impure with a primary source of impurity, you would dip it in the mikvah on the outside, and spread it out in the chel, the area right outside the wall of the Azaram, because anyways, that has to be waiting till sundown, and so you couldn't bring it back in till sundown. If it was new, they would purposely spread it out over the colonnades, where everybody can see it, so everyone can get a chance to peek at it, a glimpse, and see how beautiful it was. Because of these cases where things would become impure and they had to be replaced, every single utensil in the temple had a 2nd and a 3rd replacement for it. In case one of them became impure, bring the second one. Second one became impure, bring the 3rd one. The final officer, the one who was appointed over making the priestly garments, he would deal with preparing the clothing for the regular Kohanim and the high priests, and weaving them from scratch. Everything was done under his supervision. The Lishka Hoisalei Bamikdash, he even had a chamber in the temple, somewhere around over here, where they would store the clothing for the Kohanic garments, and lifting up on this, for the next 3 chapters, the Rambam is going to describe in great detail exactly how they went about making the priestly garments.